Hello, how are you today? Let's go ahead and talk some more about Task 3 of the edTPA. Is suitable for um, all handbooks. Um, this also would be considered Part 3, and it is most appropriate for, um, even though I'm using examples from elementary math and elementary reading, it's pretty much appropriate for any handbook. You need to view the other two videos, Part 1 and Part 2, in this All About Task 3 series. Let's go ahead, and so far we have discussed selecting an assessment, establishing the evaluation criteria, and collecting and analyzing student work. So part 1 was about choosing the assessment and creating your evaluation criteria, and part 2 was about the analysis of the assessment, how to present that. So we're going to be talking about the work samples and about documenting your feedback on this video. So first of all, you need to choose 3 work samples, and the way you choose those work samples, I'm trying to get off here. You want to choose work samples that are appropriate for your data. So I know what the handbooks say. Choose a focus students that representative of high achieving, middle, all this stuff. Make sure one is of a special group. Truth is, when you read Making Good Choices, it says, after analyzing the whole class data, review the patterns of learning you found. Choose 3 work samples from focus students that illustrate identified patterns from your analysis. So, the most important thing to do is to choose work samples that are that illustrate the point that you're making in your analysis. So let's say that you've analyzed your work and you have found some 3 learning patterns. This is something that all the students are doing well on. This is something that all the students are struggling with. Here's a common misconception. And so to further illustrate your point, you need qualitative data from your work samples in order to show it. So you want to find work samples that are representative, that show a range of performance on assessment, so that you can point to specific examples of understanding, misunderstandings, and patterns of error. This is the most important thing you do. After that, you can consider that you would like to have a focus student that has a significant learning need. But if you look carefully at rubrics and condition codes, this falls into what I call a category that I would refer to as strongly suggested. Not required, because if they required you to come up with a focus student with a significant learning need, then these focus students would be identified in your context for learning, and it's not. So now I will say that if your handbook, if you're one of those content areas where you need to have your focus students earlier so that you can video their work sample, then you're going to have to kind of anticipate who your focus students are going to be. So look at your own handbook and think about how you're going to do the work sample on your assessment. And if it's a video, even though we almost always suggest that you select the focus students after analyzing the whole class data, if you're videotaping work samples, it could be you're going to have to select those in advance. So again, read those carefully in your own handbooks. So just to reiterate, you are going to find patterns of learning in your assessment, and then you're going to choose an example work sample from each of the patterns that you found. Unless you're doing video work samples, in which case you may need to plan ahead. Maybe pick 6 kids that you are going to video and then choose from that 6. These are the artifacts. You can see that your work samples are going to be called Part A Student Work Samples, but you'll have Part A Student Work Sample A, Part A Student B Work Sample, Part A Student C Work Sample. So you're going to actually have 3 files. A minimum of 3 and a maximum of 3. There's not going to be 6 files, and there's not going to be 0 files. There's going to be 3. So you can submit as a work sample. Most of you can submit written work or an audio work sample or a video work sample. Everybody needs to look at their own evidence chart. Evidence charts are found in the back of your handbook. Around page 40 to 45, you'll start to see them. They're in a landscape mode, and they are very specific. So you need to look at your own. And notice that very specifically it says to mask or remove the students' names. Make sure your name's on there, the name of the school, before you scan the work samples. If the student's writing is illegible, you'll need to write a transcription directly onto the work sample. You need to, instead of their name, write student 1 work sample, student 2, and etc. And then refer to that to them correctly in the assessment commentary. Don't talk about Johnny, say student 2. So when you're naming each work sample file, also include the student number on that file. Student 1 work sample, student 2 work sample. Okay. Make sure that you're reading everything that it tells you about video work samples, audio work samples, all of that. I would go over this in detail, but everyone needs to really look at their own evidence charts in their own handbooks because they're not all the same. Next, you need to think about documenting feedback. And documenting feedback, first of all, it's important that you understand what feedback is and what it's not. Feedback is not putting a check or an X on work. It's not saying plus 3 points or minus 2 points. Feedback is not a grade. Putting a 90% or an A or a C or even an F is not feedback. Feedback is not a smiley face or an emoji, and it's not praise. Now, praise and these types of things may be things that are practical. I'm not saying they're bad things. I'm just not saying it's not. I'm saying that it's not feedback. Feedback is specific. It's helpful and it's practical and it's relevant to the objectives. So let's say, for instance, you've got a student that you know, you know in your heart of hearts, this student could do better if they would just listen to directions, right? Well, saying to the student in your feedback, please listen to directions, that's not relevant to your objective because you're not most of the time ever going to have an objective where they learn to listen to directions. So that's an expectation, not an objective. That's a behavioral expectation. So it's important that you not make your feedback for this assignment, not make your feedback about their academic performance or their behavior. So you need to actually make your feedback about you, so you can say things like, I can see from looking at your assignment that you're still struggling with place value. I can see from one thing that you, and you can give them some advice about what they can do to help them solve their problem. So your feedback needs to include some commentary on their strengths that you noticed in relation to the objective of the lesson and their needs. Again, what do they need to do? Sure, you can tell them till you're blue in the face that they need to pay attention. That's got nothing to do with the objective. And a strategy for improvement. So we want clear and specific information that's related to the objectives. You should not provide not provide a description of the feedback, but rather you need to submit the specific feedback. So this feedback can be you're submitting an artifact. So it needs to be the feedback that you actually wrote onto their papers, or you can video yourself giving feedback to students orally, and this would be important to do with non-readers. So you want to make sure that your feedback is developmentally appropriate. And this is really important for early childhood and for special ed and for kindergarten to maybe even second grade, to be considering about whether or not they should give oral feedback. You can provide feedback on a separate video or audio file, but it has to be the actual feedback given directly to the focus students. So this is not a description of your feedback. It cannot be a description of your feedback. It has to be the actual feedback. So you can't say, this is what I said to the kid, and then quote yourself. We have to have evidence, an artifact that shows that you did that. So you need to include areas they did well, where they need to improve in relation to the learning objectives. All right. Also, a strategy for improvement is good. Comments just like, let's review the relationship between slope and y-intercept, because I see you're making the same error in several problems, and this gives some very specific type of feedback. The evidence of feedback, again, can be written onto the work samples, and one of your questions, it'll ask you, where is your feedback, and you'll just say where it is. Or it can be an audio file. Look at these file types, or it can be a video file. Again, file type. You do not have to have a feedback file, but they can't score Rubric 13 without it. So if you don't have a separate file for feedback, make sure that feedback is written onto the work samples. And you can have a maximum of 4 files. No page limit. And I want to talk about this 4 in a minute. No page limit for written feedback. No more than 3 minutes per focus student for video and audio feedback. No more than, we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so feedback, you want to, feedback that's not included as part of the student work sample, then you would submit 1 file for each focus student, a document, a video file, or audio file, and label the file with the corresponding student number. Student 1 feedback, student 2 feedback, student 3 feedback. If more than 1 focus student appears in a video or audio clip, upload the same clip separately for each focus student who is seen, heard, and label it appropriately. If you cannot be heard, then you need to, on your video or audio, you need to attach a transcription of the inaudible comments and make that no more than 2 additional pages. Put that at the end of the assessment commentary. Or you can embed the quotes with timestamp references in the commentary response. That's my favorite one right there. As a score, I think that's the easiest. Or you can insert captions in the video. That's a nice one too for the score, but it's very time consuming for you as someone who's a student. Right here, notice it talks about academic language, and we've not gotten to that part yet, but we will soon. In task 3 for rubric 14, you have to submit a academic language use file, and that's this 4th file. So that's where that's coming in. If you have an academic use file that is an additional video clip or an audio file, then that can be submitted here in Part B. So again, evidence of feedback, you want to have at least a minimum of 0 files, a maximum of 4 files. Rubric 12, just to go over that, Rubric 12 is how your feedback is assessed. You want feedback to be specific, addressing either needs or strengths will get you a 3. If your feedback is specific and addresses strengths and needs, then that gets you a 4. If you have feedback that's specific and addresses both strengths and needs as related to the learning objective, and then you also provide a strategy for your students, or you indicate some kind of connection to prior learning, then that is a level 5. I think making a 5 on rubric 12 is very doable. Here is a document that I made that can guide you in giving feedback. Something like this for you might be helpful. So even if you were writing their feedback on the back of their work sample, if you could write the feedback for student 1, write the objectives that you're giving feedback about, and or the evaluation criteria that you're giving feedback on, then discuss their strengths, then discuss their needs, and then give them a strategy for improvement. This right here can guide you in making sure that you give good feedback. So you have to have your strengths and needs need to correspond with objectives and or evaluation criteria. And if you do that, then it's going to be a 3 or a 4, depending on how well you do it. And then in order to get a 5, you include strategies for improvement. Here's some evaluation criteria that people have done with feedback. So this person has given some really good feedback. They've got lesson 1 evaluation criteria, lesson 2 evaluation criteria, and then has given feedback in relationship to that. Using that evaluation criteria, here you can see this feedback. Student work sample, student 2 work sample, student 3 work sample. And notice that they've used a different color for their feedback. And what that did was that it made it easier for the scorer to see what's the feedback and what's the student's writing, because otherwise, when it's all the same color, sometimes it's harder to tell what's feedback and what's student response. Excuse me. And then this person gave a feedback sheet that included the rubric at the top, the level of performance highlighted, and then feedback summary. This is very nicely done. So that was feedback for student 1, feedback for student 2. So you can do this. Look at that. Remember, a really great job on this. And then feedback for student 3. So that closes up what we're going to discuss for now. Next, we'll be talking about how in our next part, we'll be looking at how to plan to help students with using feedback and understanding their feedback, which is very important. So I hope that you're doing well. Take a few minutes and before you start the next video and think about how you can prepare documents that you could use for feedback that would be very clear for the scorer to see that you've given feedback on strengths and needs and given a strategy. You have a great day. Thanks for tuning in.